Hello, class, and welcome to the greatest, most fantastic, fabulous Professor in the Kitchen video of all time. Okay, I hope you have prepared yourself, alright? Because today we are going over, and tomorrow a little bit, soul food, and we're starting things off with barbecue, okay? I apologize for my outfit here. You're seeing me in my barbecuing clothes. I've been in and out of doors all day cooking this awesome, I don't know if you can see, oh, the juices are spilling. Ow, Bernie's, this pork butt / pork shoulder. Apparently the pork shoulder and butt are the same. Like I thought one was the shoulder and one was the butt. But no. The butcher said that they're the same cut, and they are not from the butt, they're from the shoulder. But anyway, I have had this out on the grill, which I've kind of rigged up to be a smoker all day today, cooking away at like 225. Yeah, and the reason I start off with barbecue, and I pick barbecue for sort of the representative meat of soul food, is because it is really like one of the earliest sort of distinguishable and definably American dishes, and even to a certain extent one of the first New World dishes. And the reason that I do this during Slavery Week and not during in a couple weeks, I think it's last week when I go over white Southern culture, is because what we associate with the South, with Southern food, is so heavily influenced by not just African food history and elements and indigenous food history and elements, which we covered, but specifically enslaved African food elements. And I was actually at a little bit of a loss as to which way to go with this, because I could try to recreate slave food and what slaves would have eaten during the enslavement period in the early to mid 1800s in the South. But a lot of that food was very bland, was not the best cuts of meat, was kind of scraps, things thrown together, and they did the best they could with it. But I wanted to give you a sense of when slaves were given creative power, when they had full access to resources and whatever spices and things that they wanted, which unfortunately was often when they were cooking for white people in the big house or in the plantation house. That is when you have the emergence of this amazing and wonderful soul food that is so prevalent and characteristic of Southern cuisine even today. So let's backtrack a little bit and talk about first barbecue. Okay, well, isn't that just grilling outside? Yes and no. So there's the action verb, barbecuing, which my husband, like if you grill a hamburger or a hot dog and it's outdoors in England, that's barbecuing, okay? No, I'm talking about the very specifically American word, noun, barbecue. I mean, I guess you barbecue, but its most prominent characteristic and what it's come to be associated with are, especially in the South, kind of twofold: pork, but also the cooking method, which is called low and slow. Low temperature, long time cooking, okay? And that doesn't mean that people haven't been doing that kind of cooking or similar things all across the world since time immemorial. They have. But this low and slow style really became a thing in the New World and was first introduced to European settlers through Christopher Columbus, through first contact in Hispaniola. The Taino Indians would erect these like little wooden structures over like a pit with hot coals or with rocks heated up, and it was a spit. They would put meat on it, and then they would slowly turn it for a very long period of time to cook it. And we've lost the original Taino wording for it, but the Spanish translated it into their language as barbacoa, which eventually became barbecue. Okay, so this very quickly moved from the Caribbean on into the on the North American mainland through more Spanish explorers, through De Soto, who brought over pigs. And historians think that the first barbecue on the mainland between Europeans and Native Americans with pork occurred near, I think, Biloxi, Mississippi, or somewhere in Mississippi. We have a student in the classroom there. Anyway, yeah, in like the early to mid 1500s. So very early on, this kind of communal gathering around pork, around a pig that you would cook on a stick over a fire, that rapidly became an integral part of this new and burgeoning food culture. Okay, so this would have been, like I said, a major communal event, and in the South, more often than not, it's going to be pork. And that's true to this day. If you go to Georgia, Louisiana, if you go to the Carolinas, all the way up to Virginia, pork rules the roost in barbecue. You ain't going to see any beef, okay? You might see a little chicken, because somebody's on a diet. But other than that, you don't really see barbecue beef, like, oh, brisket, which I do love, until you get over to Texas barbecue, which they have their own wild and wonderful versions. But yeah, the reason that we focus in the South so much on pork came from way back in those just after contact times, when Native people had adopted pigs into their cuisine, into their regular consumables. And I tried to bring in some of the African elements already with this. So I was trying to find a slave recipe, or even an African American recipe from the early Republic era of some kind of rub to do on this meat, because I knew I wanted a really nice, delicious, like crunchy, crispy bark, and I couldn't find anything. And then I found out through my research that there are actually only 5 African American written cookbooks that are in existence before 1900. And they're pretty sparse, okay? Crazy. In the whole United States, 5 before 1900. And the reason for that is it's twofold. One, African Americans in that time still had strong traditions of oral histories, of recipes being passed through family and generations, but more importantly, a lot of slaves were illiterate and were not allowed to learn to read or write, and so of course it was more difficult to document these things in the ways that Anglo-Americans would and did, okay? So I had to get a little bit creative. So I decided to combine basically some spice elements from where these slaves would have likely come from other slaves they would have come into contact with in the New World, in the West Indies, and of course a few indigenous elements. So from the African perspective, I put in 2 different spice rubs that I kind of mashed together. Peri peri, which is from West Africa, and is like a spicy, peppery, kind of vinegary, tart mix. It's got like cayenne, of course garlic and onion powder, some ginger, paprika, and then I also incorporated, I think it's called either sayu or suya, which is a spice rub from southern Africa, and that has mainly one of the big elements is ground peanuts, which peanuts were a major part and still are a major part of soul food, though now they've been kind of relegated to like an appetizer, or if you've ever had boiled peanuts in the South. But yeah, ground up some peanuts with some more spices, and then from the New World I put in lots of brown sugar, probably more than anyone in their right mind would want to use in the 1800s, but I like the way it caramelizes, and filet powder, which is a New Orleans spice mix that's largely from, I think, ground up sassafras root, which gives it a slightly medicinal hint of anisey, licoricey smell. But all in all, it has made this awesome, amazing, beautiful dish. And so the slaves that would have been cooking, you know, in the big, oh my God, there's a moth, would have been cooking in the big house. A lot of times this is where the pitmaster would emerge, okay? The origins of the pitmaster, of the pit barbecue, was you would often have a slave who was really good with meat. And let me tell you, I've been cooking this thing for, I think, 14 hours today. I have basted it with apple cider vinegar every 30 minutes. I have adjusted the temperature, okay? And I have a gas grill with like a smoke box. Oh, it was also smoked over pecan wood, which smoking over like flavor or over like certain woods for certain wood flavors was a Native American thing. They often used pecan, hickory, mesquite, pimento wood. But anyway, yeah, you really had to nurse this meat and watch it and make sure it doesn't get too hot, doesn't get, you know, or the temperature doesn't get too low. The bark forms perfectly. The center's cooked. It's crazy, okay, the amount of time. And I would imagine with much more rudimentary technology, it would have been even more difficult. So a slave cook would become the pitmaster and would often even rise up in the community as the pitmaster, even in the post-Civil War era. For both whites and blacks in different communities. And that is where pit barbecue comes from. Hello everybody, so we're getting ready to go over and taste test our soul food, but we gotta do our sides, okay? And as you can see, day after barbecue, I've washed all the smoky grease off me and I'm a little bit more presentable, which is good. So, wow! We are cooking some collard greens, okay? Any kind of greens were already a tradition with African peoples, with slaves in Africa. Different types of leafy greens like this were often stewed for a long period of time in a broth with onion and other spices. But once it gets sent over here to the New World, slaves start doing this a little bit differently. Now in here I have started up rendering some fat off of some salt pork. And salt pork would have been likely part of the slave rations that you would receive as a slave in most places. And it's just like really fatty. It's like a fatty version and a saltier version of bacon. And oftentimes you'll notice if you're ever in the South and go to somebody's home and have any type of vegetable, it's going to be boiled. Sorry, boiled. I say boiled, funny. It's going to be boiled with a big old hunk of some kind of meat. Usually not prime piece of meat, but pork. Okay? And this is because with not quite as many seasonings as they would have normally had access to, slaves had to use what they had. And in that case, it was often that big old chunk of salt pork or scraps of pig left over that they would be given. So a lot of people do their greens with ham hocks. I like to use bacon or salt pork because I think it adds in flavor, and then you don't have to pull out a big bone or a big weird chunk of something. You can actually eat this with it. And I wanted to show you what the actual leaf looks like. Now these things get pretty big. They grow out of the ground. My dad actually is now running a quite lucrative collard business called J&J Greens in South Georgia. But collards are just my favorites. A lot of people will have the turnip greens, mustard greens, mixed greens. There's a whole wide variety. So, and they do sell these at the grocery store periodically. Ooh, we getting smoked. Lord. And what you do is you just chop it up like so. And once you get enough of that fat render, then you are going to throw it all into the pot, get it nice and greasy and oily. Okay? Now, if you do get collard greens and decide you want to try these out, they're amazing. They have so much iron, so much vitamins. Really good for you, and pretty low calorie. But you're going to want to, I call it stripping greens. Wha-bam! You're going to want to strip off the leaf part, because this is like Yuck. That's why you want to buy fresh. They sometimes sell it already in the bags, and they just have chopped up the greens. And it's like a blasphemous sin that when they get it, you get it prepackaged, like in those big salad bags, they leave the stem. Ooh. Which this will always, it might get a little softer, but it's always going to be a little bit hard, and you want your greens to be soft and velvety, let me tell you. So, I think we've got just about enough fat rendered here. Now I am not going to go, again, as basic as you would have seen. Look at my big knife. On a plantation, I am actually using a few more spices and things. I got this recipe from a really, really old black lady when I lived in Pennsylvania. And honest to God, this recipe is better than my mama's. Shh, secret. So all you do is you start adding in, and I'm just going to put it in that oil, some garlic powder. Ooh. Crushed red pepper is key. You want a little bit of spice to those greens. And then I'm going to go ahead and throw these in. Now this might look like way too much for this pot. Woo! It'll make that. It'll do that. Don't be scared. But it's going to shrink down. If you've ever sauteed like spinach. Oh my God. Oh my Lord, inhale garlic powder. Yeah, it's gonna wilt down. Wow, this is gonna definitely be a professor in the kitchen video to remember. So we're gonna add in the rest of the greens. You can see they're already like shrinking down. And then once you get these all properly coated, the next critical part of good greens is called the pot liquor. P-O-T space L-I-C-K-E-R. Now you might think that's like liquor, alcohol. No, we call it pot liquor. And if you have a good, like it's kind of like a broth that you're going to cook this in. And if you have a good one, then it can, make greens go from like this sad vegetable that you feel like you need to eat because it's healthy to pretty much an out of this world, amazing, delicious green experience. So, for my pot liquor, I just do like a splash of this apple cider vinegar. Because of the region of Africa that this sort of cooking technique and this sort of preparation of greens came from, they often add a sort of a vinegary, peppery sauce to it. And in the South today, you go to any Southern restaurant, you're going to find Texas Pete's pepper sauce. Woo, woo. This is absolutely an endorsement of this company. Maybe they'll send me free Texas Pete. But that's what you put on your greens. You always put hot sauce on your greens. At least where I'm from. That's a big thing. Okay, so we've added that. And I'm going to add a touch of molasses, which would have been probably one of the only sweeteners that slaves would have had access to. Ooh! And what's going to happen is these greens are going to get darker and darker and darker until they are a really dark color. And the last thing I'm going to add is, you'll all be so excited to see, if you have followed closely my kitchen videos thus far, dun 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 dun, the return of the big yellow cup from Dickies. Also hoping to get some free Dickies. So I'm just going to pour in some water, enough to cover. Some people will boil like a full pot of water, but I personally like to reduce down everything. I feel like it adds more flavor and it concentrates all the stuff you just put in there. And I also like to use either chicken broth or add a little bouillon cube for seasoning. Boom! Okay, and once you get this in the pot, y'all, you're good to go. Like, that's the beauty of greens. They sit and they stew and they stew. And that's all they do. And then you eventually drain them and serve them up. Okay, so now we are moving on to another staple of soul food, which is cornbread. So initially, cornbread would have been super, super simple and would have come in the form of those hoe cakes that we talked about in the last kitchen video. It would have been just like water, cornmeal, a little bit of salt, and then lard. And it would be fried over an open fire with some kind of implement, okay? But as slaves are cooking in these bigger houses, they're going to have access to other things, obviously. And one thing that early European settlers started to do was mix in flour with that cornmeal to make something in between the cornbread or the Indian puddings that people ate prior to contact and the European bread that they were used to at home. And thus was born this hybridized cornbread, okay? So I have here all mixed up, mostly cornmeal, like 1.5 cups of cornmeal. I have about 1/2 cup, 3/4 of a cup of regular white, all-purpose bread flour, and then a little salt. And then you're gonna make up the liquid part. So this is 2 eggs beaten, a cup of buttermilk, which is a critical one. And I like to add a little bit of creamed corn. Some people add in sugar, but I prefer to try to give it more of the corn sweetness as opposed to just a straight up refined sugar sweetness. And then you're also going to want to put in about 6 tablespoons of melted butter. Because it's true, butter makes everything in your whole life better. And if anyone tells you differently, they're lying. Okay. And to bring a rise to it, I'm using like 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda and 1.5 teaspoons of baking powder. So there you go. And what you're going to want to do, you just pour it in, you mix it. Now when you make cornbread, it's okay for it to be kind of liquidy, doughy, okay? You're going to need to think about it more like a cake batter than like you're making a bread dough which you could roll around. This is going to be poured into a pan rather than rolled out. Okay, so you can see it is pretty liquidy. You also don't really need to worry about the lumps because you don't want to over mix it because that's going to end up hurting the rise on it, and you do want it to be kind of fluffy. And then you just pour it into a greased little dish here. So we're scraping this in here, and all you're going to do is bake it at 425 for 20-25 minutes. Alright, so now we have come to the last side dish I'm making, which you may or may not have heard of, but is a really strange, beautiful dish characteristic of soul food, and that is Hoppin' John. And as I was doing research on this dish, I found out that Hoppin' John is not exactly what it is today. And it has really evolved a lot more than these other recipes that we're looking at, okay? And this dish is almost like a mixed fry-up of the Holy Trinity, which I've added a little Cajun flair. The Holy Trinity is a Cajun cuisine. It's bell pepper, celery, and onion. Very, very common in most of their dishes. So I've got in here fresh bell pepper from the garden, outside, jalapeno for just a little bit of spice, and you see chopped up celery and sweet onion. And again, you render some salt pork or some bacon fat, and then you saute those vegetables until they're translucent. And then you're going to add in the other 2 key ingredients. And now the other two ingredients outside of the pork are really what this dish was all about in the 1800s. So in the 1800s, Hoppin' John would have consisted of a Carolina rice cooked in some kind of broth until it was almost overcooked. It would consist of salt pork, or whatever kind of pork you had on hand to add a bit of flavor. And in the 20th century, it became a thing to put black-eyed peas. And black-eyed peas, or black-eyed beans, as they are known in other parts of the world, are a traditional African style of bean. So they got that, you know, right. But in reality, the actual beans would have been more like peas, and they would have looked more like this. These are very difficult to find outside of the South nowadays. They were traditionally like a sea island red pea, I think, or it was a ruddy color, a really meaty bean, kind of almost like a lima bean, or if you've ever had a butter bean, that would be added in. And so there you'd have, you know, this reddish colored rice with beans, and then the pork. And these other ingredients sort of got added in throughout the 19th and early 20th century. I figured I could Cajun it up and make it a little bit more like that, just to add some interest. But we're going to be using half black-eyed peas and these cream 40s that are actually from South Georgia. They're from my dad's garden. I had them frozen. So I thought, ooh, that's what they would have eaten. Cream 40s. Now, I refer to these as dirt peas, which makes my mama mad because she's like, those are good peas. But they're actually a type of cowpea. And cowpea or field peas would have been the choice here in the 1800s. So, I'm going to add this in. And I'm going to add in the black-eyed peas. Actually, I think I'm going to just go ahead and use all that right there. Stir it around, and pretty soon my rice will be done, and I'll add that in, and you kind of just let all the flavors simmer together for maybe 20 minutes or so. Some people leave it on longer for like an hour, but you really just want to heat up. My beans are pretty processed because they were cooked and frozen, and then these are canned. So I'm going to finish this up, and then the very last thing I'm going to make is the original barbecue sauce. Yes. Right, so now we have come to our the final stretch, getting ready to pack up and go to our tasting at Coors Hall. But I did want to make some kind of barbecue sauce, and I actually have one of the earliest printed recipes for barbecue sauce, which is from the 1800s. And now different states have different styles of sauce, and you know, have that as their sort of claim to fame. You've got Memphis style, Kansas City. Texas tends to do more rubs than sauces. You've got Carolina Gold, and you've even got crazy Alabama doing some kind of white sauce, which I ain't even had before. But you'll never guess who is the winner for the OG barbecue sauce. It is South Carolina. Shout out to a few of our students from South Carolina. You win the prize for the earliest barbecue sauce. And because of that, the style was a mustard and vinegar based sauce, not a sweet sauce. You could occasionally find Carolina Gold, which is a slightly sweetened mustard vinegar sauce in like Walmart's here and grocery stores out in the West. Other parts of the country you don't have a hard time finding it, but it's that beautiful goldish colored sauce. But originally, the sort of base of this sauce is going to be some kind of fat, like a butter, okay? So I got a little bit of melted butter here, and you're then going to add mustard powder. Why mustard powder? Well, because there were a lot of German immigrants to the Carolinas, and they brought their... I just cut my finger. This is dangerous. Anyway, ow. They brought their taste for sour mustard, vinegar, that kind of thing with them. Alrighty, so I'm just going to add some mustard powder. If I wanted to be really hardcore, I would have added some, or I would have ground up my own mustard seeds, but I just ain't that hardcore, y'all. Yeah, so you're going to stir that up. The recipe also called for like some ground red pepper, but instead I'm going to add a dash of hot sauce. Louisiana hot sauce. Oop, that was a little more than the dash. And then the final ingredient is, oh my god, I keep inhaling the spice. The final ingredient is, it says add in a vinegar substance enough to make it be a little acidic. Okay, so I'm using apple cider vinegar because I think that the apple will go really well with the pork. And then you just stir that up. Now this is like super liquidy, okay? So I am gonna cheat and add cornstarch as a thickener, but I guess it would have originally been this liquidy unless you used like a creamed butter. Doesn't that sound healthy? A cream butter based barbecue sauce. Yeah. Woo! And this definitely is smelling like that mustard style sauce here. Okay, so I will be packing up and I will see you soon for our tasting. Hey everybody, so we're here on campus for our soul food tasting. So by now you've watched and seen me make all these different dishes, and now we're gonna sit down and have a chat about slave food, the evolution of soul food in the 19th century with Dr. Schermerhorn. So if you could just introduce yourself.
All right, so I'm Calvin Schermerhorn, professor of history here at ASU, and can't wait to try this delicious looking food in front of me.
Now you are also a Southerner, right?
Yeah, I grew up in Southern Maryland. I'm most familiar with what I guess used to be called Carolina style barbecue, which is vinegar, and we're gonna see how deep those roots are.
Okay. Wow. All right. So I didn't realize that it went up that far. Yeah.
Well, Virginia barbecue is kind of like an amalgam of North Carolina barbecue and then whatever kind of local traditions there are. But it's more like that than it would be like Memphis barbecue, which is more sweet, or Texas barbecue, which is beef.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, so with these different dishes, we're kind of looking at like the Hoppin' John here has New Orleans influence. The collard greens are very much like deep South. The barbecue sauce is Carolina. So in Virginia, which I haven't really talked about at all, like what does soul food mean to you as a person from Virginia?
Soul food just means home cooking. It's things that are flavored with salt, with pepper, deep fried, boiled, flavored with bacon, flavored with pork. So anything along those lines, and you can make it spicy or not, and usually good and filling.
Yes, and I talked about it in the video. It's every Southern vegetable is boiled to death with some sort of meat, usually pork, which kind of unnerves people.
Right. Well, why would it do that? Why would they do that and not serve fresh collard greens? Right. I mean, isn't today what we like to eat? All kinds of like kale, blended up into smoothies. Right. Why not do that back in the 19th century? What do you think?
Well, we did talk a little bit about that's where the African tradition comes in.
Okay. Right, so it's more tradition, it's more cooking tradition than it is like, I'm afraid of fresh vegetables.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's what this is really, as I was sort of doing research for this and going through these different foods, I mean, I knew that the African influence was there, I knew that the indigenous influence was there, but the fusion it makes is so international, and in a lot of ways, by like the mid-1800s, had really overtaken the European roots that like some of the recipes from the late 1700s had still.
Yeah.
And you don't think of Southern cuisine as something that is so internationally representative, but it really is.
Yeah. Good. Wow. So what should we think about first, or try first?
Well, I say let's first dig into the barbecue.
All right.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have some of mine first without the sauce, and then with the sauce. And the class, they got to see me in my barbecue clothes yesterday, but this cooked for like 14 hours.
It was quite good. It's a little bit smoky. It's not like overly salty. The flavor of the pork comes out nicely.
I think we're so used to with barbecue having it just slathered in sauce. Mm-hmm. But this really gets back to that very simple cooking, smoked over, pecan wood, and with the spice rub and just a few splashes now and then of apple cider vinegar to keep it moist.
Yeah, it is quite delicious. And of course, the animals would have been fed differently too. I mean, they wouldn't be fed, the way that kind of factory farms do today with all kinds of corn and tasteless stuff. They were out in the woods and, eating just about anything they could find. And so the meat's going to be a little bit more tasting like wild game than what we usually think about that from the grocery store aisle.
And with Dr. Vixico last week, we did a venison stew. And you don't really think about how game tastes until you taste it, and it really does have a very, like a velvety, earthy twang to it.
Oh, yeah.
We also went over kind of the history of barbecue, early Spanish exploration, and and pigs kind of becoming the big staple of southern meats. And I had a question for you. I mean, why pigs? Why not chickens or cows?
All right, great question. So pigs take care of themselves, right? So, in Arizona we've got the javelinas running around. Not exactly pigs, but they can take care of themselves. They can defend themselves. So if you have, say you like lamb, but you don't have a lot of pasture to devote to sheep, those sheep, they're going to get eaten. They're going to get taken by wolves. But pigs are pretty good at defending themselves. They're pretty hardy, and they can forage for themselves. And so since the colonial days, what you do is you'd fence your crops in and fence your pigs out. And if you go and look back at the records of colonial Virginia, you see a lot of disputes over pigs. And the only way you could tell ownership of them was how the little notches they cut in the ear, kind of like branding them. But that's what you did. You just fenced your pigs out, and then when you wanted meat, you went and collected them. They usually slaughter them in what they call hog killing time, right? Right after they've had enough to eat, but before the food disappears, so they're nice and fat. But that's when you got your fresh meat and you started to smoke and preserve whatever was left.
Okay. And we talked too about this type of American style of barbecuing, which is that low and slow approach, is great for when you do have meat that is going to be a little bit more muscular, a little tougher. All right, so I'm going to test out this sauce here.
All right.
And this probably has the most European influence of anything on the plate here. We discussed that the German immigrants into the South Carolina area who brought over mustard spice, more tart, sour flavors.
Yeah, this is a great example of food exchanges, because you can't say this is purely West African, because there's a long tradition of barbecue going back to West African, but you can't either say that it's purely German, that so we've got German, forget the terms for it, but that kind of vinegary, that barbecue kind of recipe.
Yeah, it's a lot of tart and bitter flavors.
I think it's sauerbraten or something like that.
This is actually really good.
It is really good.
And it's just, this is basic. This is like butter. It's quite healthy. This is a very healthy meal, by the way. I'm sorry. This is butter mixed up with, mustard powder, a splash of hot sauce, and apple cider vinegar. That's it.
Yeah, and it doesn't taste mustardy if you're thinking about it. It's not like you're squirting mustard on your barbecue. It has a nice heat to it, a nice little twang. It's nice and rich and full, and it complements the smoky meat very nicely.
Yeah, because that's the real travesty. It's when you have great barbecue and it's just been slathered in that sweet red sauce, and you can't really taste the quality of the meat. All right, so let's move on to the sacred pairing of the greens and the cornbread over here. So the greens I prepared in a very special pot liquor recipe that I got from a very old African-American lady who had moved from the South to Pennsylvania.
Wow. Those are quite tasty. You wouldn't think boiled greens would be, have a nice pop to them, but they do. They've got a nice little spice. They're nice, evenly cooked, still a little bit firm, so you're eating something that's not just mush, right? If you ever had collards out of the can or canned leafy vegetables, that does not have that consistency or taste either.
I've never had the canned ones. My grandmother would be rolling in her grave. She knew I ate canned greens. I noticed that a lot of these foods, and we talk about, this would have been a lot richer than what would be eaten by slaves on a regular basis. I told them this is essentially the big house food. This is if they had all the resources available, what they probably would have prepared regularly for the plantation owners. But what influences are in these dishes that would have come from them having to work with provisions or what they were given? Because I know that's where salt pork comes in. So what can you tell us about what slaves ate on a regular basis? And
Yeah, so first of all, the leftovers, like you mentioned, these were cooked in pot liquor. If you're gonna discard that, an enslaved person working in the kitchen would not discard anything that was edible. So there's actually some testimony. A man named Leonard Black, who came up in Maryland, talked about getting nothing but the pot liquor. And pot liquor just means the stuff that you cook the vegetables in. There's no alcoholic content to it. So you get the leavings, you get the worst stuff, any sort of coarse corn. Flour, cornmeal, parched corn. Sometimes you hear about old plantations having a corn crib. Everybody had a corn crib. In an age before refrigeration, you had to elevate the corn so that the rats and mice didn't get at it. But you also didn't eat a lot of sweet corn. The corn that you got was kind of intentionally grown to be like flint corn. It's stuff that you would dry and then mill later. So they would eat that. They would eat what's called hominy, right, which is corn boiled so that the little husk comes off and you got that center part. They eat a lot of corn bread, a lot of unleavened breads, or just basic breads, anything you could cook at a hearth. Because mostly what we're talking about is people are cooking over an open fire with coarse ingredients. And so a lot of cornbread, a lot of stewed things, the pot liquor and any vegetables you could get. Not a lot of meat, but a lot of like what we call offal or OFFAL, or intestines, organ meats, plus whatever they could catch or kill, like squirrels or whatever you can catch out of a pond, or if you're near a lakeside, catfish. And now you can start to see a lot of the things that are in soul food, right, or that are in traditional cooking, which is it's not pork tenderloin, right? It's more of the things that the people who are a little bit more well off would not want.
Yeah,
under normal circumstances.
Still in the South, you can find in certain grocery stores pig's feet.
Oh yeah.
Now, speaking of breads, that brings us to the cornbread, and this is kind of a marriage of what the traditions of making like hoe cakes, griddle cakes, but combined with some of those European ingredients. So this is half flour, half cornbread. It does have some leavening agents. I did end up sweetening it a little bit with molasses, but that was about it.
Another delicious item. It's nicely baked, first of all, and it's got a little bit of a nuttiness to it. The corn, a little bit sweet, but not overpowering sweet. If you go and get cornbread from like Boston Market or one of those places, it's going to be like cloyingly sweet, right? But you're right. If you just have a little molasses, it's not going to be sweet like that. You're not putting a lot of refined sugar into it. Most of what sweetens it is the natural sugar in the corn. And just a little molasses for flavor.
Well, and I read this fascinating article about, again, the evolution of these foods, and there were interviews with black Southern cooks who said the difference in black-made cornbread and white-made cornbread is the sugar. They're like, cornbread should be greasy and savory, and it's used almost like fufu is in Africa. It's used to scoop up that sauce, the pot liquor.
Yeah.
Whereas in white Southern kitchens, you do get that really sweet honey cornbread mix.
And I'm glad you mentioned that it's greasy a little bit too, because in a kitchen in which your food is scarce, you're not going to waste anything. And so when we're talking about hoe cakes, traditionally these things are like pancakes cooked on the end of a hoe, a gardening implement. But a lot of the cornbread and a lot of the breads period are going to be made in an iron pan. Right, and then you're going to use the grease, lard, excuse me, whatever cooking fat you have, and use that to kind of that's going to be what makes it so it doesn't stick to the pan.
And all of these dishes were made, with the exception of this, which has butter. All these were made with rendered fat from a big chunk of salt pork. So I tried to be as traditional as I could, and everybody likes bacon, so. If everything tastes like bacon, that's wonderful. All right, so let's move on now to the Hoppin' John.
All right.
Which I couldn't find out a whole lot about it, with the exception that it sort of came from, I mean, like, what wasn't it the original slave ship food, red beans and rice, or the bean and rice combination?
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us any more about it? Do you know much about Hoppin' John?
Except this is really good. It's really delicious. He's got a combination of corn, black-eyed peas, and rice.
Oh, not corn.
Not corn.
Oh, so let me explain this part. I mixed in what are called cow peas from my dad's farm. They're cream 40s, but they're sweet. They're kind of meaty.
They are.
And they were considered field peas.
Very good. All right.
So I found out that at least the black-eyed peas were a little bit later entrance into the dish, and that from this you would have just used field peas. Yeah.
Good. Well, again, to give your fast food kind of reference, if you go to Bojangles or KFC or one of the places that serves red beans and rice, you're going to get overwhelmed by the saltiness and by just the what do you call it? The sauciness of it. The point is that you can taste the vegetables, and that's a good thing. And it's not that the salt or the sauce overwhelms it. It's just it actually tastes healthy. But I know, right?
I tricked you.
You tricked me.
It is not healthy. But I will tell you, like, and so my grandfather was a full-time farmer, and my grandmother stayed at home. Well, she had to because she cooked. He would eat this. This would be at lunch, and then he would have a similar thing, a meat and three for dinner. For breakfast, he would have eggs and biscuits and the works. And he's in his 90s, and he is a skinny man. He is a skinny man, and so it just shows you, like, you think when you eat this, oh my gosh, you gotta go take a nap. But this was like food for field work right here. This was food for outdoor work.
Oh yeah.
I feel like I've read that in colonial Williamsburg, it was estimated that the average person there ate like 3,000 to 4,000 calories a day.
Wow, if they could get it, they probably did.
Yeah, I mean, if they could get it, that was how much they would need to get through the day.
Yeah, that's an interesting subject. What is the trade-off between food, nutrition, and medicine? And we still think that, if you can eat a hearty lunch like this and then go work in the fields, and it's going to work out. It's going to be okay. There's a little bit of debate about that because more and more in archaeological findings, they're finding that even people who had a very active sort of work regimen also would develop things that we usually associate with precursors to heart disease, like plaque in the arteries. So it's not as if they got a pass on it. So there's the speculation is that a lot of people were going to die of infectious disease before they got cancer, before they got heart disease, and so that kind of masks it. But on the other hand, you've got a grandfather that's has had an active lifestyle and is not like it's not as if he took a nap right after dinner.
Exactly.
But timing was important too, and you usually think about having a big supper right after the end of the day, come home, and I guess if you're going to eat moderate, if you're going to get ribs and beans and rice from your favorite takeout place, you're probably not going to want to move too much afterwards. But most of the big meals were taken in the middle of the day.
And still in the South, when you have breakfast, but then lunch at noon you have dinner. It's dinner, and then in the evening you have supper, which is usually lighter than dinner.
So barbecue was a common food made for political meetings. And so oftentimes you'd have African American cooks who'd go and kind of lay a little lattice, spread the meats out, get the fire going, get the meats out there and start smoking the meat. And it's a long process, but political rallies, if you like, in the 19th century, I mean, they were off limits to women usually and off limits to people of African descent. But it's not as if everyone showed up at the same time. So having a lot of smoked meat around, sending out that aroma, gathering people from all around, have discussions of politics and invariably pass the whiskey bottle around as well, or cider. That's generally what they drank. And so that this was a good old barbecue it might be code word for a political rally or a 4th of July party, something like that. So sometimes we think that the Germans were the ones who introduced food as sort of a festive thing, because if you go back to the 17th century and people wanted to, your Puritan holidays were days of fasting. Okay, yeah, not what we really want. One of the original Thanksgiving days, I think, was a day of fasting. You'd hear this from time to time. We'll have a national day of fasting and prayer. Well, the Germans weren't about that, so they would say, no, let's celebrate with food. Let's mark a holiday with food. And so that's why we get things like hot dogs, and coleslaw, donuts, things like that, lagered beer, right? Everything that you can buy at a ballpark. And so these were kind of German innovations. But the West African traditions, too, were more about feasting with food and marking holidays with food and not fasting. So these are both breaks from the old English tradition, or the more austere English tradition of the Puritans.
Well, I guess my last question for you, which I asked the same of Dr. Fixico, would be, what is your... Well, so we talked about how food memory, food smells are so strong.
Mm-hmm.
And so what for you, from your childhood, is like your strongest food memory?
Well, that's a good question. My folks were fairly frugal, but I guess it's a pot roast on Sunday, and it's not necessarily a good memory because they kind of overcook it. But it would be that it was Sunday when you smell that pot roast smell, and the weekend's about to end. You're about to go back to school, and that's it. So the kind of ritual of the weeks. But it's interesting you asked that question too, because in the historical frame, as Americans moved west from the seaboard, they generally took their tastes with them, and so they tried to recreate those things. And so this is a good excuse for people to find ways of preserving their food to go with them. And so sometimes that would mean salting their fish or putting oysters, somehow preserving oysters, but it also meant when you had railroads, you could have fresh foods travel longer distances. Mm-hmm. So people in the city could get their veggies or their fruits that they liked. And people were pretty attached to the traditions that they came from. So there's this big, you've probably heard of it, the corn-pork divide, the beef-pork divide. Like south of the Ohio River, it's more pork, and north of the Ohio River, it's more beef. The same thing with the corn and wheat divide, mm-hmm. Wheat breads versus corn breads. And a lot of it had to do with how well things grow, but it also had a lot to do with what people were used to growing up.
I would imagine a lot of this would also have to tie in with environmental factors and seasonality, mm-hmm. and you would see much more seasonality, and there's certain things that even if at my house, if we didn't go to the grocery store, we would only have corn for a few months out of the year. Yeah. We would only have greens in the winter. So this might not occur in the same sort of combination, right, if I really thought about it and how it would have come across somebody's table in the 1800s.
Yeah, that's a great point, because you could only get food in season. So we see that sometimes now with farmers markets where it's a certain time of year and you're getting good tomatoes, you're getting good blueberries, you're getting good watermelons, but we kind of take it for granted. And one of the things that's a tell about this is, if you like blueberries, look where they come from. Look on the package. Right now, was it April? You're gonna see them coming from the south. In February, March, they're all coming from Chile or Peru or someplace in South America. And then the little cycle starts, and they start coming from Mexico, California, and then the best ones, right, are coming from New Jersey. They're coming, and then eventually in late summer, they're coming from up in Canada. So here's how the seasons go. But if we were talking about food in the 19th century, we wouldn't be talking about blueberries in April. We wouldn't even be thinking about blueberries in April unless you can preserve them. Mm-hmm. And so same for so much, like your corn on the cob, to the extent that people ate that and not thought that was kind of trash food. You're only going to get that for a short time in the year.
And that also brings up
the evolution of the actual recipes. So I like to give the example of banana pudding. So my grandpa's favorite banana pudding recipe, which is in the trifle dish and has the layers, is a baked banana pudding. You actually put it in and you bake a meringue. And then I started researching this and found out that the banana pudding that most people use now in the South is the cold banana pudding, almost like a icebox pie. And that was actually a northern recipe. Well, it makes sense because we didn't have refrigerators. You know, could bake it. It would last a little bit longer than if you had to keep it fresh in a cold space.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating to think about how much of our cuisine and our taste evolved based on just preservation.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. Yeah, Americans have been eating bananas for a long, long time. I think back to the late 1860s, early 1870s. So a little bit after the class ends. But and they also ate different kinds. But some of the bananas that were popular back then have gone extinct now or were wiped out by blights. But that's interesting. It's interesting too that the recipes change.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's about it for us. So thank you to Dr. Schermerhorn for being part of our experiment here on the camera.
Well, thank you, Dr. Watkinson, for a scrumptious meal.
Yeah.
Wow.